And now there is something that we are still missing here, which is not related to content management, well, not directly related to content management, but very important, and that's access control. We have seen that by just adding the admin attribute to the controller, we get some basic level of that, because then at least not everybody will be able to access the actions in this controller, but we can go or implement a bit finer grained access control than that as well. And not surprisingly, we have a service for that in Orchard, and that's actually also included in Orchard services. So if you take a look at Orchard services, there will be this authorizer service, which is, well, for authorization, as you may have guessed. And it has, well, just one method that you are able to use, but several overloads. And in its basic form, it asks for a permission. So we have seen how permissions and roles and user management comes together. The basic concept should be clear even from the UI. Now, what we can do here corresponds pretty much to that. We need to check for a permission here. So this overload of the authorizer.authorize will check whether the current user has the permission that we are asking for here. So we need a permission. There are a few built-in permissions in Orchard. Well, there are many built-in permissions in the various modules, but there are also so-called standard permissions. Permissions in the Orchard core, and there are three of them. Access admin panel, which is, well, to be able to access the whole dashboard. So if a user can do anything with this controller, which is an admin controller, they should already have this access admin panel permission. Where the access front end, by default, everybody has that, so that's well, the ability to access everything apart from the admin area. And the site owner permission is kind of the super user, the God mode. So if you have the site owner permission, you can do everything and anything. So we could, for example, ask for the site owner permission and just allow super users to access this section. And in this case, since the authorizer returns a bool, we might also have a hunch that if this is false, then the user doesn't have permissions. And that's actually what happens. So to be good HTTP citizens, what we could do here is that we could unauthorized. We could return an unauthorized response here. Now, well, this is an actual object, so we need to have new here. So if the user is not a super user, he or she will get an unauthorized result. Now, this is a topic of information security that we won't cover, but you may want to return a 404 here as well, not even to expose to unauthorized users that there is a resource like this, instead of returning an unauthorized resource and actually telling that there is a resource, like personal list dashboard, just you can't access it. But for now, we will stick with a simple implementation. Well, but site owner is kind of a very hardcore permission, so probably we don't want that for all of our personal list managing users. So let's create our own custom permission. Now, And how permissions work and permission providers work is, well, it touches on the topic of dependencies, injected dependencies as well, and it will be also of our own, it will be also our first own provider that we implement. Because as mentioned before, there are a lot of extension points in Orchard, a lot of kinds of extension points, and one of the extension points, one of the kind of extension points are providers, which are basically injected dependencies that implement the interface and will be automatically processed somewhere in the pipeline. Now, if we create a permission provider, that will be, well, a provider as well. How we commonly name permission providers is just permissions, if there is one, only in the module. So let's create a class called permissions. And as mentioned, this will be a provider, so we will need to implement some kind of interface here. And actually, it will be iPermission provider that we need to implement. Let's also implement it. Well, the feature property here in this case is not interesting, so we can just create a property for this and be done with it. But the others are more interesting. What do we see here? What do we have to implement? Now, the getPermissions method will, as you can see, return a collection of permission objects. So these will be actually our custom permissions that then you can give to certain user roles. And the getDefaultStereotypes method will basically tell Orchard that by default this and that user role should have this and that permissions. So it's a default set of permissions corresponding to user roles. You don't necessarily need to return anything here. I mean, you can return an empty enumerable, but obviously the point of having a permission provider is to at least return some permissions. So that's what we will do here. Commonly, the technique of how we create permission objects is that we create static fields for them. Why is that? If we take a look back at this personalist dashboard, we see that we can very conveniently use this site owner permission because there is a field for that, or a static property. And if we take a look, it's indeed a static read-only field. So it's quite convenient and good for the actual usage to expose our permissions like such static fields. So let's go back to our permissions class and create our first permission, which will be, as we have seen, a static read-only field. And let's call it something like manage person list dashboard, just to have some basic name for it. And it needs to be, what are we implementing now? A permission. So it needs to be of type permission. So let's create a new permission object. And what do we have to add here? Now there are 5 properties, but we don't need to fill each of them. Well, there is the category, which, well, it's sometimes useful if you have a lot of permissions. Well, description is just as a hint for users, just as a name. But sorry, no, the name is actually a technical name. Now, implied by is something more interesting. You can basically chain permissions together So you can say that if a user has this permission, then that also means that they have that and that permission as well. So you can somehow make permissions depend on other permissions. This is what this implied by property does. And there is also this required ownership, requires ownership property. Well, we have seen that content items can have owners. Now, if you feel, or if you set the requires ownership property to true, then the permission will also will only actually allow anything, yeah, or will authorize will only authorize the user if the user is also the owner of the supplied content item. Because if we take a look at this authorize method again and its 4 overloads, you will see that 2 of the overloads have an iContent object as the parameter, which can be basically a content item. So this means that you can also authorize not just against the user, like we have done with this first overload, but also against the content item. So in this case, we will ask whether the user has the permission to manage person dashboards. But you could also ask whether the user has permission to manage this item of, or this person list item that we are fetching here, or creating here, or fetching here. But we will go with the simple version just now. So let's fill the 2 properties that are actually required. The name will be just a technical name, so we could use the same as for the field. And the description, well, let's give some context here. So able to manage or interact with the person list dashboard. Because that was added dot. And that's it. Now we have our first permission. It was quite easy, I think. And now we also need to return it from this permission provider, because although we have this static field which allows simple usage, Orchard yet doesn't know about it. That's what the permission provider is for, and this get permission permissions method. So let's return this permission here. And we are almost done. We could also supply some default stereotypes here. Well, for example, we could say that, okay, well, not authenticated users, but administrators surely should be able to manage person list dashboards by default. So we could also return a permission stereotype like this here. So again, just any enumerable, and let's add a permission stereotype to that. And what does this permission stereotype contains? Well, it also has a name, just for reference, for the role name, and the permission for, well, the collection of permissions that role should have by default. So, well, I said that administrators should be able to manage person list dashboards by default. So the name should be administrators here, since that's the name of the role. So this is not just any name, but it should be exactly the name of the role. And the permissions that we have here, well, just again supply the manage person list dashboard permission. And that's it. We basically have a complete permission provider. So let's also authorize against it. If we go back to our controller, and instead of standard permissions, we use our own permissions, we will see some magic happening. So I've hit Ctrl Shift S again, And now we are going back to the personal list dashboard, and we'll see what happens. In the meantime, let's also go back to users. Well, the page has reloaded and it's still displayed, and that's good because we are an administrator. So actually what we wanted with the stereotypes took effect. Now if you go back to our user screen and open roles and administrator, yeah, I messed up. What I messed up is that I've used administrators here. It should be actually just singular administrator because that's the name of the role. If you take a look at, or if you search for our own custom permission, like personal list dashboard, you can see that it's here. But even though we are administrators, it's not actually ticked. Well, in effect, it is allowed because administrators are also site owners, as you can see. So they have this super user permission I mentioned before. So that's why they still can access the dashboard. But let's fix this issue. I fixed the name in the stereotype, in the permission stereotype. And now after the page reloads, we should be able to see administrators also having that permission explicitly. And that's still not the case, which should have some reason. I'm not sure about it. But the thing is that this test user, however, shouldn't be able to access the dashboard, although it's an administrator, so it will still be able to do that. But other users who have the access admin panel permission won't be able to access the personal list dashboard without also having that manage personal list dashboard permission explicitly.